Welcome, Brennan, my videographer. Welcome to our abode, and please, let's begin the process of my memorializing the Ancestry.com family tree that I created. Should I start now?
Sure.
The vital statistics for each of the 118 persons listed in the digital family tree I created using Ancestry.com, including birth and death dates, locations, relationships, and pictures. Rather than repeat them for this digital record, I want to recall my memory of relevant stories about each. So we'll start with great-grandparents. Not much is known about our great-grandparents because when the English invaded Ireland, they burned all the churches where the records were kept. So luckily, my brother Jack and his wife Terry went over to Ireland several times, and from tombstones and Bibles and memories of people, they were able to determine my paternal and maternal grandparents, great-grandparents. Jack and Terry spent many hours putting it together, and I was able to just port it over to the family tree. So we know where they were born, where they were raised, and where they died. All of them died in Ireland, and all of them died in Tipperary for some unknown reason. When Jack and Terry went over there for the first time, Jack, as he's quite accustomed to do, went to one of the bars, and as he walked in, the bartender took one look at him and said, "You're a Quinlan." And from then on, he was able to make friends and associate with a lot of people in the area. More about Jack later. My grandparents are a different story. My paternal grandfather came from Ireland around the turn of the 19th century. We have an actual picture of his signature on the records kept at Ellis Island. And he came over, and then for some reason he went back, and brought back with him his brother James, who would be an uncle to me, except I've never met him. And we don't know much more about James, except that James lived with my dad until he got married, and then James moved further south, and we heard he was a bartender, and that's all we know about James. But my paternal grandfather, Cornelius Quinlan, was a motorman for the city of Chicago on the streetcars that they ran, and there's a great picture of him in his motorman uniform. My grandmother, Grandma Quinlan, there's also a really good picture of her with me holding me as a baby. Both of them lived at 37th and Low, 1 block from Nativity Church. I'm sure my grandmother was a devoted churchgoer. I'm not sure about my grandfather. They had my dad and 4 daughters. My dad had 4 sisters. Mary, Bridget, who had a middle name of Veronica and was called Ronnie all her life, Catherine, who was called Kath, and Helen. They all had children except for Mary. Mary died very young, had a heart condition, and died rather young. My Aunt Ronnie was married to my Uncle Dan, and they lived at the same home at 37th and Low, where only my grandmother resided, and they stayed with her until she died. Uncle Danny worked for Sears and was able to acquire one of the first color TVs. And I can remember as a kid traipsing down to 37th and Low to watch The Lone Ranger in color. He worked for Sears all his life, retired, and eventually they moved to Cleveland, uh, where they raised my cousins, Danny and Mary. Actually, she's called Katie Mary O'Connor. Um, they all were in Cleveland, and we went to all of their weddings, the two weddings that they had in Cleveland. Um, Uncle Aunt Catherine, Aunt Kath as she was called, uh, married Robert Engelman, um, and they had four children. Actually, three children: Connie, Karen, and Robbie. And Connie married several times and had children, but we've lost track of them. We don't know what happened to any of them. Karen was married and had a couple children. Again, we don't know what happened. I know she's not married anymore, but we don't know what happened. Robbie was married and had one son, and his wife died rather early. And Robbie and his son moved to Arizona, and we've lost track of them. And Helen married Uncle Sid. His name was John, but for some reason he was called Sid all his life. Helen and Sid, on their honeymoon, had a horrible car accident. I remember I was in 8th grade and was pulled out of 8th grade and told about the accident. I vividly remember that experience. Because of that, they never had any children, but they stayed devoted to each other and lived on the south side of Chicago near Midway Airport all of the rest of their lives. Sid died first, and then Helen became invalided and moved in with Robbie and his wife, and eventually she passed away. As I said, Aunt Mary never married and died young. My dad and my mother both went to Nativity Grammar School, which was literally a block away from their home. My mom was a year older than my dad, and I'm not sure they knew each other in grammar school, but eventually they got together, married, and had 3 sons, Bob, Jack, and me. My dad was a employee of the city of Chicago for all of his life. He worked for the water department and was one of the people that helped the city get going. He was conscientious, and he worked, and he didn't play politics, although he was the alderperson for the ward that we lived in. We lived most of my younger life on Emerald, but then we moved and bought a home on Low Avenue, 3358 Low Avenue. They bought a 2-flat with my Aunt Bessie and Uncle Mike, who I'll discuss later. My dad was also the president of the Municipal Employees Society of Chicago, and when he died, the city council issued a beautiful resolution commemorating his life and memorializing his death. And we have that. I have that, the actual resolution framed in one of my offices. My mother was a homemaker until the boys were old enough to be on our own, and then she worked for the city in a different department. For the life of me, I don't know how they got to work. I don't know if my dad drove or what, but the first car we ever owned was a used 1948 Buick that I think he got in about 50 or 52. That's the car. It was a stick shift. That was the car I learned to drive on in Comiskey Park's parking lot. It was a fun car to drive. I had a couple accidents with the streetcars with it, but somehow it managed to survive, and we got along fine. Moving down to my brothers. My brother Jack was born I was born in 39, Jack was born in 43, and Bob was born in 46. Jack, we all went to St. David Grammar School because even though it was like 6 blocks away, because at that time parishes were created by outline, and we were in the parish of St. David, which was a grammar school which had the school on the first floor and the church on the second floor. We had to walk up to go to church. I was a pretty good student. In 6th grade, the nun that was in charge of food for the rest of the nuns recruited me in my little red wagon to do the shopping with her. And we would go to Kroger, which was in Chicago at the time, and do the shopping. I missed a lot of class by that, and by the end of the year, she almost flunked me. By 7th and 8th grade, I got better grades and was doing fine until through grammar school and into high school. My brother Jack, on the other hand, was a little bit of a terror in grammar school. By the time he was in 7th grade, the nuns had called my family and my dad and said, "We think he's ready to graduate." So my dad pulled some strings and got him into De La Salle High School. My brother Bob was a better student and lasted the full 8th grades at St. David, and went also to De La Salle High School. I would have gone there, but I chose to go to Quigley because at that time I thought I wanted to be a priest. I spent 5 years at Quigley, which was 4 years high school and 1 year college. I spent another year at the major seminary in Mundelein, and then decided, what in the world am I doing here? And left and finished up at Loyola and met the love of my life there. Jack was the only person who got drafted into the Army, and it was the best thing that could ever happen to him. By then he didn't want to go to college, so he had gone to DeVry Institute and learned a lot about electronics. In the Army, he taught electronics in Washington, D.C., and never was sent to Vietnam. When he got out of the Army, he obtained a great job at IBM and stayed there the rest of his life. Bob went to college at Loyola and got a business degree and ultimately married Maureen, who we'll talk about later. Jack married a wonderful woman named Terry Schlief, who had been married before and had 2 children, Doug and Keith. Jack and Terry raised those boys and had a daughter of their own named Chrissy. Bob had 2 sons, Rich and Bill, and Bill never married and is yet anyway. And I'm sorry, I take that back. Bill was married briefly for probably a year, and then that marriage ended in divorce. Rich had 2 children, Connor and Keeley, and married a woman who had 2 daughters, and raised the daughters until they were in high school. And then Rich left the family, and the last thing we've heard about him is that he's consulting as a business consultant in Qatar. He had with Leanne, he had 2 children, twins, Connor and Keeley, and they're just about college age right now. They would be the grandchildren of Bob and Maureen and my great-grandnephew and grandniece. I could tell a lot of stories about Jack and Bob. I think I'll tell one about Bob and then one about Jack. Many years ago, Bob ultimately became the chief financial officer for Kane County. And Kane County had a baseball team called the Kane County Cougars. And the Kane County Cougars had a stadium that was leased to them by Kane County. And it was in the process of negotiating a new lease. And Sue and I happened to be at a wedding of a mutual friend's daughter. And we were at a table with another set of couples, and one of the men in the couple was one of the men was it turns out to be a big investor in the Kane County Cougars, and he was bemoaning the fact that he was dealing with a chief financial officer who was giving him all kinds of trouble and demanding all kinds of things. And I said, would that happen to be Bob Quinlan? And he said, yes. I said, well, that's my brother. Jack, on the other hand, there's just too many stories to tell about Jack. One of the ones I find the most funny was at his wake. Many people poured in, and this one woman came in sobbing. And I said to Terry, who is that woman and why is she so upset? And she said, that's Jack's bartender. Jack liked to smoke and drink, and I think that led to his early heart attack, which killed him instantly, which is, I guess, a good thing if you're going to die. Bob and Maureen suffered greatly physically. Bob had an unusual illness that is not genetic, in case Jennifer ever listens to this, that is very much like Lou Gehrig's disease, and ultimately became bedridden and decided he wanted to die and went on a hunger strike, and he went into hospice. And we saw him go from maybe 170, 180 pounds down to less than 100, and eventually he died. Maureen had COPD and was on breathing apparatuses at home, and eventually was on an inhalator in the hospital. And when they told her that Bob died, she asked to be taken off the inhalator, and she died the same day. So we had a joint funeral for both of them. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about my first cousins. Danny Sullivan Jr. Had several children, mostly boys, and then finally a girl. He was married to Jean. He died in 2019. I'm sorry, he died in 2021. One of the boys that Danny Sullivan Jr. had was a defensive tackle on Michigan State and was a giant. That whole side of the family was totally devoted to Notre Dame and lived for Notre Dame football. But whenever Michigan State played Notre Dame, it was a real conflict for them, especially for my Uncle Sid. He didn't know what to do. Anyway, that child of Danny Sullivan Jr. has a son who is 6'3", 210 pounds, and is a freshman quarterback at Northwestern. Mary Kay Sullivan, we call her Katie, married Tom O'Connor and lived in Iowa for most of their adult life and had 3 boys, Kevin, Liam, and Sean. Two of the 3, Liam and Sean, moved to Chicago, actually live in Skokie. And the third one lives in Minnesota someplace, but is moving to Chicago. Because of that, Tom and Katie moved from Iowa to Chicago, and they lived in Skokie. Katie still lives there. Tom died in 2019. Katie has become a great-grandmother to all of these children. Liam and Sean have many kids, and Kevin is expecting, so it's with his wife. So it's a great experience for her, and we get to see her a little bit because she doesn't live too far from us. That takes us to our children, Katie, Michael, Julie, and Jen. Katie has become Kate. When she was born, she was Kathy, but somehow we switched that to Katie, and in adult life, she switched it to Kate. And she's married to John and has 4 wonderful children: Emma, Noah, Brennan, and Rowan. All of them went to St. A's along with their cousins, Sydney, Jenna, and Joey. They went to St. A's Grammar School and graduated. Some of them, Emma's out of college and doing what she loves to do as a bird watcher. Noah is doing what he wants to do in computer science. Brennan is going to become an intern, his 3rd year at Holy Cross, going to Washington, D.C., and Rowan just started at Xavier. I can't say enough about Xavier University. It's a great, great school. It was a great school for Noah, and hopefully it will be a great school for Sydney and Rowan. Michael lives in New York. Julie lives not far from us in Evanston and has a stepdaughter named Brittany and 3 wonderful kids named Sydney, Jenna, and Joey. Jennifer lives in our condo downtown and commutes every day to Evanston to work for a company called Skirmhorn. And she's in financial reporting for commercial real estate. I have many nieces and nephews and grandnieces and grandnephews. Doug and Keith had many children. I should say Doug has had many children, and his children have had children, which makes Terry a great-great-grandmother at a very young age. Keith has had 1 child named Sean and they live in Atlanta. Chrissy lives near Boulder, Colorado, and has 3 boys. Remus, who they call Rocky. Remus is apparently named after Remus Lupus from the Harry Potter series. George, nobody knows where that name came from, and Walter, nobody knows where that name came from. Moving on to the Collins family tree, it turns out that Sue, the 2nd or 3rd Mimi, depending on how you count, has a whole folder of information, and which we will try to supplement with another video later in the year or sometime before we die. We have records, thanks to this folder, we have records of Sue's great-great-grandparents, great-grandparents, and grandparents. Okay, according to Sue, Kate O'Loughlin is Grandma Mimi, and that's Sue's great-great-grandmother. And the original Mimi is Mabel O'Loughlin. Sue's mother wanted to be called Mimi, but I'm not sure any of our children ever called her Mimi, and Sue has become Mimi. Sue's mother and father were Maurice and Ethel Collins. Maurice died at very early age, at 57. But before he died, I was able to very timidly and with great trepidation ask him if I would be permitted to marry his daughter. He said yes. We celebrated by going to Michigan Shores, where they were members, and where Sue had taken me on our 2nd or 3rd date to swim at Michigan Shores and eat at a small snack shop they had there. I'm from the south side of Chicago. I've never seen anything like that in my life before. It's a whole new world up here. And after her father died, they dropped their membership, and I only got to go back there to celebrate different people's weddings. Interestingly enough, Sue went to St. Francis Grammar School, had Sisters of Providence teacher all the way through, and I went to St. David on the near south side of Chicago in Bridgeport, and had the same Sisters of Providence teach me. Sue's father was in advertising and was a very nice man. I enjoyed talking to him. Sue's mother, who was christened Ethel, is called Peggy, and or Mimi when the grandchildren came along. I'm not sure I realized that, and I'm not sure any of our children were. She died in '74. I'm not sure any of our children called her Mimi. Sue had two aunts that doted over her and took care of her and took care of our grandchildren. Children and, no, just children, I guess. Probably not grandchildren. Catherine, who was called Cocky, and Florence, who was called Booty. Cocky married Olin, who was a consultant in the print engineering business. We're never quite sure what he did, but he was very successful at it. Booty worked at the Edgewater Beach Hotel, where we had our wedding reception because of that, and was a secretary to a man named Ed Reynolds. When Ed Reynolds' wife died, Booty wound up marrying him, and they continued working for the Edgewater Beach Hotel until it went into bankruptcy. And Booty and Ed lost all of their profit sharing and pension rights because at that time there were no laws that required pensions to be funded. And so they lost everything. Uncle Ed had to continue working even though he was way over 70. He worked unbelievably, he worked as a security guard carrying a gun for Resurrection Hospital. Booty had a stroke and was paralyzed and in a nursing home. Uncle Ed took care of her, lived near her, visited her every day, and couldn't have been more devoted. I think he just worked himself to death taking care of her. He died, and then Booty died a couple of years later. Cocky and Olin lived in the same condo that we still own. Actually, they leased property there, and when the building went condo, they had a triple unit built out, which contained a studio and a 2-bedroom. And Olin used the studio as his office. They took the kitchen out and just made it into a 2-room thing, a little living room and a office. And they had a divider between the 2-bedroom and that. When Olin died, Cocky continued to live there and went into hospice in 1991, I believe, and passed away in 1991. Sue inherited, among other things, the condo, and the first persons to live there were Kate and John until they had Emma, and then they ultimately moved up to their home in Wilmette. Michael moved in while he was going to law school and lived there, and eventually Jen moved in with him, and then Michael moved on. He went to Detroit to work for an advertising company and ultimately a different advertising company in New York City. Jen continues to live there and has lived there 25 years. We remodeled the place and turned it into a real showcase in the early 90s. I can't remember the date. And Jen lives there happily and shares it with her grandchildren when they come down for various events in the city.
And I'm going to get next. Right?
And Brennan expecting is as one of the persons vying to live there next, except Jen's going to live there a long time. Sue has had a brother named Dennis who also went to Loyola, was a little bit younger. When they were growing up, I'm told They fought so much that one time their parents just opened the car door and let them go into a field and fight. Ultimately, Dennis is the one that gave Sue away at our wedding. Eventually, Dennis decided to move to San Francisco, and we lost track of him for many, many, many years. On a business trip to San Francisco, Kate found him and encouraged him to come back, and ultimately he did come back and visit with us, and we stayed in touch with him until he died. Sue has cousins that she's never met. Her dad, Maurice, is from Dodge City, Iowa, and has several brothers, including one brother we know of for sure, Uncle Julian. And the only time we ever met Uncle Julian was at Sue's father's funeral. He came all the way from California. But knowing a little bit about him, we know that he has had children and probably grandchildren. And so Sue has cousins that she's never met. Hopefully we can enlarge the Collins family tree with a little bit more information as we go through the folders. I know this much. We're able to go back to 1825 because the predecessors of the Collins, actually the Cannon family, Booty, Cocky, and Mimi Collins, were all Cannon sisters. Go all the way back to Ontario in 1825, and when somehow they came across the border and started raising the families in the United States that ultimately led to the O'Laughlins and the Cannons, and etc. Okay, the third group of people I want to talk about are the Bowmans, Carrolls, and Murrays. My mother was a Bowman, and her mother died in childbirth, not giving birth to her, but another child who also passed away. When my mother, her father was a railroad man and couldn't take care of her or her brother John, who was my Uncle Johnny. So my mom was pawned off to a distant relative named Grandma Carroll, who had 11 children of her own, and then took my mom in as a daughter. My Uncle Johnny was pawned off to military school after he threw a racer at the nuns at Nativity over some argument they had. Uncle Johnny was a character, and I'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. My mom became a sister to Aunt Bessie, Aunt Alice, Aunt Ann, Aunt Lolly, Uncle Joe, and I don't know how many more because we don't have any other records. Aunt Bessie and Uncle Mike bought the home we were probably from 44 till my mother and father died, 1944 till my mother and father died. They lived on the second floor and we lived on the first floor. Aunt Bessie was an employee for Western Electric. And in 1915, Western Electric planned an outing that required taking a ship from the Chicago River to the other side of Michigan, to Lake Michigan, to someplace in Michigan for a picnic, the lower part of Michigan. The ship was called the Eastland, and it was loaded with people to the point where it started to capsize and ultimately did capsize. 844 people died, and the only reason my Aunt Bessie and Uncle Mike didn't die was because they were late to get on the ship, and by then it was so crowded they were not allowed on. The story about the Eastland, you can go to eastland.com, and there's a whole video. It's an amazing video of actual pictures of what happened in that disaster. As I said, my Aunt Bessie worked for Western Electric. When I knew her growing up, she was old and overweight, but I'm told by my brother Bob, before he died, that she was a supervisor of switchboard operators for Western Electric, which is really AT&T. And she used to supervise a whole row after row of switchboard on roller skates. It's hard for me to picture my Aunt Bessie on roller skates. When Aunt Bessie and Uncle Mike had no children. When they died, my mother inherited, in quotes, the second floor, and the building became hers exclusively. My brothers Jack and Bob and I were firmly convinced that they had salted away gold coins in the walls up there. And for many years we searched, tapping the walls to see if we could hear anything about gold coins. We never found any. We were also told never to go in the attic because the wolf lived in the attic, and I believed that until I was probably an adult. My other aunts, in quotes, Aunt Alice was a very religious person and spent most of her life praying for her family. She never had any children. My Aunt Anne was the sort of the black sheep of the family because she got divorced. She had my Aunt Lolly with another man, and then ultimately Aunt Anne married Jim Tisdale, and they moved to Arkansas. My Aunt Lolly was probably my favorite aunt. She was a young woman when I was born, and she wanted to be my godmother, but my Aunt Alice, who was sort of the matriarch of the family, said no, she couldn't be because she was too young and couldn't assume the responsibilities of a godmother. So she became the godmother of my brother Jack, and my Aunt Helen became my godmother. Aunt Lolly had married a very nice man named Al Murray, and they had a lot of kids, 4 kids. I've only kept in touch with one of those kids, Allison, and really haven't talked to her in years. She contacted me when my Aunt Lolly died. Sue and I went to the funeral, and I brought up gifts, and we went afterwards to the cemetery and ultimately to a lunch, a brunch, and that's the last time I saw Allison. Joe Carroll, the son of Grandma Carroll, was the patriarch of the family. He was in charge of all finances for the whole family. And when Aunt Bessie and Uncle Mike died, he's the one that came over and said, okay, my mom gets the apartment building. I don't know how that actually worked, but it worked. Joe Carroll had a son named Joseph Carroll. Joseph Carroll and I really line up quite well. He went to Quigley, left, went to Loyola, finished, went to Loyola University Law School, graduated, and ultimately joined the FBI, and was an FBI agent for many years. He ultimately was loaned over to the Air Force to help with the Air Force security, and became ultimately a brigadier general in the Air Force. And there's an incredible obituary about him, which I have, and I'll give to Brennan. Maybe he can work it in somehow. He had a son named, several sons, but the one son that I know the best by name, not by person, is James. James Carroll is a fairly famous author. If you were to Google him, you would see it. He wrote a number of fiction books and a number of biographies, including a biography of his father. He was also in a seminary, and I believe a priest, and left and has a family. James is an outspoken Catholic who believes that the priesthood is the biggest problem with the Catholic Church, and he's written a very interesting paper on the subject for the Atlantic. James wrote a book about his estrangement from his father over the Vietnam War, and ultimately, I guess they reconciled with each other, and that's the theme of this book. In anticipation of this project, I dug up many pictures, which I've sent to Brennan, but I'd like to go over a few of them right now with some brief explanations, so that when he includes them, you'll be able to appreciate them. The first is a picture of my mom and Jack and Bob at my cousin Mary's wedding in 1962. My mom looks really young, and Jack and Bob also look very young. The next is a picture of my dad with me as a baby. And my dad looks pretty good. He looks young and a little overweight, but looks pretty good. The next picture is a picture of me with a very young Aunt Helen, with me as a baby. I'm not going to do all of them. This is one of my favorites. It's a picture of me with Grandma Quinlan. It's Grandma Quinlan. I don't remember her at all, but there's a picture of her holding me. There's a picture of me in a sailor suit. God only knows why. And then here's a picture of me with and Jack and Bob and my two cousins, Barb and Mary. And lastly, but not least, is a picture of Uncle Michael. As a young guy, I would think probably around 7, 8. He was water boy for Leroy Selman when Leroy was on the All-Star team that played in Soldier Field against maybe the Chicago Bears, I'm not sure. But they practiced and lived up here, and Michael was his water boy. And Leroy had his brother Dewey on the team as well. And Michael asked us if we would have Leroy and Dewey over for a dinner. And we invited them, and Sue made a turkey, and I'm shaking the table. Sue made a turkey, and they devoured the whole turkey. And there's a picture which I think I did send to Brennan, of Jen just staring at them as a little girl, just staring at them with a very unusual placement of her finger. When they had finished dinner, we asked them if they'd like to see a little of Chicago, because they had been kept up here at Northwestern the whole time. It turns out they're from Oklahoma. They've never seen a building taller than 3 stories. So we took them down to Cocky's condo. We brought them up to the condo, to the 25th floor, and put them out on the balcony, and they were just amazed as what the city looked like. We had a really good time with them. Leroy Selman and Dewey both went on to play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Leroy died rather young, and I don't know whatever happened to Dewey. I don't know where you're going to put this, but I want to tell one more story.
Sure. Yeah.
One more additional story. When Sue and I were married, I had 3 groomsmen, and Sue had 3 bridesmaids. My groomsmen were Tom Albert, my brother Jack, and John Zimmerman. I had made the decision to have Tom Albert be my best man, but my mother somehow talked me into having Jack as my best man, even though Jack and I were not that close. And to this day, I regret that decision, because Tom was my best friend, and I think it kind of caused us some hard feelings. Jack did a great job. I could still picture him trying to give a toast. He was underage. I'm not sure he could drink, but I'm sure he did drink. Um, Picturing him giving a toast and shaking so much that the wine was spilling down his wrist. But that's one of the regrets of my life, that I didn't have Tom Albert be my best man. Tom married ultimately and had 6 or 7 children, and was picking up one of his children from high school when somebody flew through a stop sign and killed him. And John Zimmerman and I went to that funeral, and we were just torn up greatly. I had just lost a good friend we had just found out that a good friend named Jim O'Rourke, a mutual friend, had died. And we didn't know anything about it. And Tom had called me and said, we've got to get together. We can't be like it was with Jim. And I said, yeah, sure. And before I could even see him, he was killed tragically in a car accident. That's it. The last part of this discussion revolves around Sue and Bill's life together. I left the seminary in 1960 because I wanted to go into Annapolis. But by the time I left, all of the admissions to Annapolis had been granted for that year, and I had to wait a year, I was told. My dad wisely suggested that I go to Loyola and get my degree, because I had had 4 years of high school and 3 years of college through the seminary program. So I went to Loyola, and I took a bunch of classes that would give me a degree in philosophy. One of the classes was a philosophy class that Sue attended. I always sat in the front, and Sue sat in the back of the class, as she does when she goes to church, as her preferred way to see everybody. She claims I kept staring at her, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's correct. Anyway, I finally mustered enough courage to talk to her. After 6 years of an all-male environment, I barely knew how to talk to a woman, but she was kind and sweet and talked to me quite readily. We ultimately decided to go on a first date, and the first 4 dates were kind of disasters. The first date, first of all, I asked her where she lived, and she said Evanston, and I had no idea where Evanston was. My knowledge of the north side of the city, of the county, ended at Chicago Avenue, where Loyola University was, and we took our courses. So she basically said I should pick her up at her aunt's apartment on Sheridan Road, which she thought I could find if I took Lakeshore Drive and got off at Hollywood. It was just a little bit north of there. We met. I picked her up. We went to downtown to the McVickers Theater to see John Wayne's version of The Alamo. I loved every minute of it. I found out many years later she hated every minute of it. When we left, we got halfway back to the parking lot, and I remembered that I had not validated the parking ticket. So I left her standing in the street in the middle of the night and ran back to get my ticket validated. We got the car. She navigated us to Evanston, and I still wanted to talk to her more, so we decided to go to the Pancake House, which had just opened that year. We ate at the Pancake House. I drove her home, and then I asked her politely to tell me how I would get home. And she said, just get on Sheridan and take it all the way to Hollywood. Well, I got on Sheridan, and I got to Dempster, and all of a sudden, I lost Sheridan. And I kept turning around and going back, and I could not find my way. Eventually, I just decided I'm going to go straight. I went straight. I finally found at one of the streets, I finally found a connector to take me over to Sheridan. I got home about 2 a.m. in the morning, and my mother and father were just aghast because I'd never been out that late my whole life. So that was the first date. The second date I asked her to was the Chicago Auto Show. We went there, and there's a nice picture of us, which I'll give to Brennan. I found out years later that she hated the Chicago Auto Show as well and would never go back to another one in spite of my many pleadings of her to go back. Our third date, she invited me to go ice skating. Well, I'd never gone ice skating in my life. I had to borrow a pair of ice skates from my friend Tom Albert, and all he had were hockey skates. And that date did not last very long. We went elsewhere. The fourth date, she invited me to play tennis. I'd never played tennis before in my life. So I again went to my friend Tom Albert, who seemed to know all of these things, and he got me a tennis racket. We went over to McGuane Park to practice how to play tennis, except there was no net. So we had to just imagine we were hitting the ball over the net. Did not go well. The fifth date I've already described as my trip to I can't even remember the name of it, the country club. Michigan Shores. I've gone blank on Michigan Shores. And that was a great date. Eventually, I was invited to her house for dinner, and the first course was a salad, a pear salad, which I had never had and didn't know how to eat. So I decided I would just wait and see when they ate their pear salad. Next thing I know, they'd eaten all their pear salad and mine was still sitting there, and her mother was greatly offended that I didn't like her pear salad. I also ticked them off a little bit by claiming that the water in Evanston tasted funny compared to the water on the south side of Chicago. It all went well. And eventually I asked her to marry me. She said she'd have to think about it. She went with her aunt to the ranch/farm in Idaho, and when she came back, she said yes. Our wedding was also a fiasco. It was on June 16th, the day, a day like yesterday, 90 degrees, high humidity, and we were the second one to be married at St. A's. There was another marriage before us, and Northwestern was graduating that day. So all my relatives from the south side of Chicago it was very difficult for them to park. The wedding went well. Many of my Quigley/Mundelein classmates and performed as a choir in the choir loft, and they did a very robust job of singing. They were also invited to the reception at the Edgewater Beach Hotel, which one of the items they had was a beautiful swan in champagne, which had become a duck by the time we got there. Other than that, the wedding was fine. After our honeymoon, we moved into an apartment on Loyola Avenue, east of Sheridan Road, and we stayed there while I started a job at Kemper Insurance. I worked for Kemper Insurance for 2 years actually 3 years while I was going through. I started law school in 1962. And law school, 4-year program, I loved it, I did well. And one of my professors suggested that maybe I want to think about transferring to the University of Chicago. But it was their law school, but I was supporting a family by then. We had Katie, and there was just no way I could do that. So I decided I would try to associate myself with the law firm as quickly as possible. I left Kemper, which was a good paying job, and I went to Jenner and Block to work as a docket clerk. And I kept the docket for all their litigation, which gave me plenty of time to study for my classes. It only paid $500 a month, but it did have insurance, and I was covered, and our family was covered. Eventually, Katie was born. Katie's birth was actually quite exciting. On a Saturday, 5 weeks before Katie was due, and we got in our little Volkswagen and drove frantically to St. Joseph's Hospital, but we had done all of our planning on the new St. Joseph's, and I did not know where the old St. Joseph's was because the new St. Joseph's wasn't ready. So I was speeding along, and a police car pulled up next to me, and I said, "My wife is going to deliver. Can you guide me to Old St. Joseph's?" And he put a siren on, and we went speeding to Old St. Joseph's. Katie was born 5 weeks or 4 weeks premature, was in an incubator, and Sue couldn't even see her for many, many days. Michael was born without much fanfare and difficulty, except that I had a moot court argument the night he was born. In the morning, I had a moot court argument that night, which I was not very much prepared for. Julie was also a little bit of a surprise. We were planning on going out to dinner with our friend Patty. By then we had moved to Oak Avenue with Kate and Michael and Sue and I were in a one-bedroom apartment on Loyola Avenue until I graduated from law school and got a job with Wilson and McIlvaine. And we had 2 porta-cribs, and we would move them around. They would be in our bedroom, and then we'd move them into the kitchen at night next to a stove, which was not a good idea. But we survived, they survived, and we moved to Oak Avenue and to a 3-bedroom apartment with more space than we knew what to do with. We could barely furnish it. Julie was, as I started to say, Julie was born on the night that we were supposed to go out to celebrate Sue's birthday with our friends Denny and Patty Hughes, except Sue started to give signs of delivery, so Denny and Patty took care of Michael and Kate, and we rushed Sue to the hospital for the delivery of Julie, who wound up coming on Sue's birthday. Jen was our move to Lincoln Street gift. She was born without incident, and I'm not going into the fact that she is the most empathetic of our children and most sensitive of our children. My career at Wilson and McIlvaine was a pretty good success. At the same time, they hired a law student from Harvard, from Yale, and from Northwestern, and me, a night student from Loyola. The poor Harvard guy could never pass the Illinois bar, and eventually left. I was the first one of the 2 remaining to be offered a junior partnership, and I think I did well at Wilson and learned a lot. They let me rotate through every department in the firm, so I learned a little bit about the entire practice of the law. I got an offer to join McDermott, Will and Emery, and I went there and sort of their securities and finance department and stayed there until the end of 2010 when I retired. Our move to Lincoln Street was terrific. We've got more room, although it's filled up right now. We had more room than we could ever imagine, and we loved it, and we still love being here. Sue's career at St. A's, I think, was very successful. She was a support teacher in kindergarten, and she also, before that, she was a first and second grade teacher, but once we had Katie, she became a stay-at-home mom, and has been a terrific stay-at-home mom for all of our kids. But by the time they all went to St. A's, to grammar school, she decided she wanted to be involved with St. A's more. So she became a teacher's aide for the kindergarten, and when she was asked by Tanny Bregel to form a volleyball program at St. A's, she established the program and had 10 successful years there, working with a lot of kids that went off to college, to high school to play, and some of them even went to college to play. And remember her when she goes to games and their children are playing at games, they come over and talk to her. Just briefly on my toys. In my career, I've had 3 hobbies: computers, boats, and bikes. I've had 6 Macs and 4 PCs. The Macs I had from the very beginning in 1984 when it came out, until my firm went to the dark side and all got PCs. I got rid of all my Macs and stayed with PCs until 2010. At the end of 2010, I got rid of all my PCs and went back to Mac, and I couldn't be happier. I've had, if you can believe this, 10 boats during my career. I bought and sold 10 boats, and I have to say, almost every one of them I sold at a profit. I went from a sailfish all the way up to a 24-foot boat, which I never sailed because I had back surgery, and it was too hard to sail by myself, and I basically sold it for what I paid for it. I've had at least 10 bikes that I've ridden, and I started keeping a record of my bike miles in 1984, and to this date I have almost 270,000 miles of biking, which is slowing down now. I'm probably averaging about 6,000 or 7,000 miles a year, but when I was really seriously biking, I was averaging a lot more than that to get to 270,000 miles. So that is our life together so far. I'm looking forward to many more happy years with Mimi. That concludes this series of my Ancestry.com family tree. Many thanks to Kate Renier for encouraging me to do this, and to Brennan Renier for being my videographer.